When we're talking about languages and creativity, we often think about the doing of languages and the speaking of languages. But very rarely, perhaps, do we think about sign language. And I think this afternoon session hopefully will work on a number of levels. So it will draw attention to, like the previous session did, that not only are we thinking about the actual medium of the language itself. So for instance, we heard English, we heard Arabic, and we heard Polish. And I think there was a bit of snatches of German thrown in as well with Bogdan's performance, if I'm not mistaken. But we're also interested in the medium through which the artists are using to work with that language as well. So as part of our strand and the work that I've been doing with Punch Records, we came up with a project within our strand which was called Slangwages. So playing very much around the idea of slang and languages, okay? This idea of truncating languages, patois, creolization, play, and performance. So we were very pleased, but also very privileged to meet and work with Rinkoo Barpaga, who is a deaf comedian, deaf filmmaker, and multiple and more besides than that. Rinku is here with his interpreter, Cam. So what we're going to do is, for about 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, no more, Rinku is going to do a urban sign language workshop with us. Then he's also going to do a bit of comedy for about 20 minutes and then 10 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A and wider discussion. Thank you. Welcome, Rinku.
Everybody, hi. How are you all? So, nice to see you all here. I know the weather outside's pretty awful, but it's nice that you're actually here. So, obviously, I have an interpreter, and I always work with him, Cam. I call him my cheap labour from Wolverhampton. I've been taking the mickey out of him like that for years. And he's been doing my voiceovers for a long time, comedy, various other things. So he knows me very, very well. Originally, just to sort of fit you into the picture, I've actually just got back from Germany. Unfortunately, my flight was delayed constantly. And I was in Germany, I was working in a refugee camp actually, working with some deaf refugees, children and adults. And I was asked to go there to do translation and interpreting work. So I was working between German staff members and obviously children or adults in sign language. And I was working as a relay interpreter. Now these refugees had come from Syria, they'd come from Afghanistan, and they'd also come from Iraq. And it was a challenge, it was a real challenge trying to communicate with them. And it had a huge impact actually, quite an emotional impact. Obviously, these are people who've lost their friends and their family, and you have to go through the process, obviously, of working with them to get as much information as you can, as clearly as possible, transferring that across to the staff and making sure that they're satisfied with what they've got. And of course, that's kind of impacted my own language, so now I've got to go back to using British Sign Language. So, let's talk about that. I don't know whether you think this, but most people assume that sign languages are the same the world over, but that is absolutely not true. So, for example, I am using British Sign Language right now. I'll show you a sign. That was my name is Rinku. And I'm using two hands, as you can see, when I'm signing that, and I finger spell it in particular. This is American Sign Language spelling my name. So that's an American way, they spell with just one hand. Let's use Japanese Sign Language. That's it, exactly. So sign languages are very, very different across the world. They all have their various languages, and I've learned a few of them. Talking about that, I wanted to tell you, and I've got some notes here, be patient with me if I'm going back to my notes. There's some things here that I thought were very, very important. So I've noted them down. I don't want to forget them. I don't want to go home and think to myself, why didn't I say that? So be patient if you spot me going back to my notes. Let's talk here then about Britain and British Sign Language in particular. British Sign Language also has its own regional dialects. So we have, just as in spoken English, you have accents from Liverpool, London, all those kind of things. British Sign Language has its own regional dialects. So I'll give you an example. In fact, why don't I teach you a little bit of basic sign language? What do you think? Yeah? All right. This is the sign for people. I'm going to use the sign from where I grew up in Birmingham. People. Here we go. So why don't you try that? Yeah? Good. Let's do that again. Very easy, very simple. Now, of course, I moved to Newcastle to work there. Their sign for people is this. So that forefinger right on your chin. I then went on to work in London, what they termed a promotion, and this was the sign for people. Now, you can see that that's just one sign, but you can see just that one word has regional variation, and you get that across all of the regions of the UK. Now, to be honest, I enjoyed that process. I enjoy the variation. So I did you know how you guys will phone people? I use webcams. We use a service, one of the services is called Sign Live, which is like a video relay service. And they had a Scottish Sign Language interpreter on the screen. So there I am signing away, and it was almost like a different language, but I was picking things out, and I loved it. I loved that experience. And that's because I felt that, in a way, I was connected to other parts of the world. Having other languages gives you that ability to connect, doesn't it? Now, of course, I want to talk to you now about my particular relationship to urban sign language. Where did urban sign language come from, for instance? And I'm going to explain the origin of it. I started to learn languages properly, obviously, as a child. When I was at school, sign language was banned. You couldn't acquire sign language at school, or at my school anyway. So I was educated in what we called an oralist school up until I was 8. About 8 years old, I met a young Jamaican. I think there was actually 3 of them, 3 black children from Jamaica. They were deaf, but they were so fluent in sign language. And I was thinking to myself, I'm deaf and I speak. I don't sign. They're deaf and they sign. So I started to acquire the language they used, and it took time. You know, I built up a language and I became fluent in sign language. At my school, I said to my teacher, I said, oh, do you know what I've been learning? I've been learning this language. My teacher went absolutely ballistic, so angry. No, that is not a language. Sign language is terrible. It's unacceptable. You are not allowed to use it. You cannot use it in the school because it will influence other students, which I was extremely disappointed about. But of course, at playtime or break time, you had the opportunity to talk to your friends in sign language. So I did. My classmates, my friends were having these conversations, and they loved it. They absolutely loved it. Of course, unfortunately, I was caught by a teacher and got in trouble. So that was the sort of unfortunate situation I was in. And actually, there are still schools and countries that do not allow sign language to be used in education. For me, my first language as I grew up was a spoken language, but I fell in love with sign language. And of course, the reason is that it's a 3D language. It really is. It's easy to understand, for me, the context of it, to grasp the meaning of what's being said. Sometimes with a language, you feel the language, don't you? It's not necessarily that you've learnt the language. It's that you feel the understanding of it, and it affects your emotions. And that's what sign language did for me. I had a strong connection to that language. Of course, later on I went on to work and I became a translator for ITV up in Newcastle. Now, at the time I started working for them, I was fluent in sign language, you know, and they said, oh yeah, this is great, we'll have this guy. So they moved me from Birmingham to Newcastle. And I realised that my sign language, in particular the grammatical structures I was using, were not correct. In fact, they said to me, you're going to have to go to university. You're going to have to get educated. Your grammar's totally wrong. And I was thinking, what do you mean? What's wrong with my grammar? I didn't even understand what grammar was, actually. So anyway, eventually, I'm going to show you an example, actually. Shame. Shame. Now, the sign language they were using was this, or the sign word was that. For me, it was this. You can't say that. That's not how you sign it. I didn't understand. Why the difference? So when I went back home to Birmingham, do you remember I told you about those three lads, the three Jamaican lads who were my friends? I realised that the language they were using, I started to understand that there was a difference between the language they used and what was termed formal BSL. So that was what I called urban sign language. And the question I started to ask was, why is there such a difference? Now, most of you know, of course, that languages, people say, obviously, of course, that languages evolve and they change. And that is true, of course they do. But maybe it doesn't quite work as clearly as that. I started to ask questions about this to my friends. There are so many urban sign languages, and it mainly belongs to the ethnic minority deaf people. So I started to gather information about this. And it seems that it actually developed, or these varieties of urban sign language developed from, well, for instance, we used to have a deaf club in Birmingham. A deaf club is a place, or used to be a place, where deaf people would all sort of hang together and not have to deal with hearing people. That's essentially what they did. So I'd go there and I'd be talking away to my deaf friends. Unfortunately, we as an ethnic minority couldn't get into those deaf clubs. That was, of course, a racial issue. So I didn't know that that was a thing, as it were. It was disappointing. You know, deaf people would ban other races who were deaf. But of course, at that time, society, that generation that lived there, the ethnic minorities were members of the Commonwealth. And of course, the migration that took place when they got here, they were disappointed with the reception that they received. Urban sign language came out of that environment. They didn't want other deaf people taking their language over. Deaf people would say to each other races who were deaf, "What are you saying? Why are you saying that?" So ethnic minority deaf people created essentially their own variety of sign language, and they've kept it. Urban sign language hasn't been officially recognised. Now, I want to say that British Sign Language hasn't in itself been 100% officially recognised. And if you can imagine, Urban Sign Language is even further behind. What's interesting is that the representation of sign language that's on television is the white British Sign Language, the old-fashioned British Sign Language, and it's very prescriptive. It's fixed in a particular time and in a particular style. I do make films, and I made a film called Double Discrimination recently. I was funded by an organisation called BSL Zone. Now, you can see that film, and it's talking about deaf people and some of the issues involved in the deaf community. And what's interesting is that particular documentary is an investigation of racism in the deaf community, which is actually a very hot topic. It wasn't an easy documentary to make. And what was interesting was that my experience of my life was that many deaf people who were ethnic minorities suffered, but because we were such a small community, we weren't able to openly discuss it. There's much more risk in a small community when you raise these issues because you can't get the opportunities from other deaf people. It was oppression, that's what we experienced. It's not just a social problem. You know, ethnic minorities who were deaf couldn't get jobs from other deaf people. Qualifications, you were further behind. So this was something that we experienced, and I thought that was a good reason to make a film entitled Double Discrimination. And of course, starting your investigation, you realise just how much information there is out there. I started getting people telling me about their life experiences, all the problems they'd had throughout their entire lives. And the thing that was really interesting to me, or one of the things that was really interesting, was the role that language played. Do you remember what I said earlier? That I personally, for me, British Sign Language and Urban Sign Language, I don't necessarily see the difference between them as languages. But when I interviewed deaf people, particularly ethnic minority deaf people, one-on-one, they'd start signing away. And I mean, I filmed this, in London, in Brixton, this particular interview. I turned up to Brixton, and I filmed this interview, and this person was telling me about their life experiences. Now, when the crew was in the room, the crew was essentially white people, essentially professionals who were in that room. And as soon as I started interviewing my subject, they were uncomfortable. And I could pick this up. I was thinking, there's something not right here. It's not working. So I asked the crew to get out the room. I thought, I'm going to do this myself. So I set up the camera. The camera's standing right next to me, and I start doing the interview, and we're going back and forth, and they're talking. This person happened to be a black Jamaican, and they're talking about their generations and the family and everything else that's with that. We finish the interview. I go back to the film studio with the footage, and I get the footage, and I hand that footage over to the deaf professional editor. And I leave it with this editor, and off I go. I'm going to make a cup of tea or whatever. And I come back, and this professional deaf person says to me, Rinku, I don't actually understand what's being said. And I said, what do you mean? What part don't you understand? I don't understand the whole thing. What? All of it? So I get this footage up, and I'm having to go through bit by bit and translate it for this guy who's deaf. And I'm translating the whole piece of footage. And at the end, I realised it was because it's the urban sign language variety that's being used between the two of us. And that was repeated again and again. Now, when we broadcast the entire documentary, and that was broadcast on Film 4, some of the most interesting feedback that I got was actually from white people. And they said, a lot of them sort of said to me, the film's great, very powerful, but how come I've never seen that language before? And I used to say, what do you mean? They said, well, I've never seen those signs, I've never seen that language variety. I know that person you interviewed, they've never used that language with me. And that hit me. And I got that story repeated again and again and again and again. And it was there that I began to really realise that urban sign languages are not represented in mainstream sign language on television and media. When we talk about things like identity, I was born deaf. My first language was an oralist language. I didn't use sign language or begin to acquire sign language until I was about 8. And I learnt it from black deaf people in Handsworth. I picked that language up and I used it as my primary language. But professional deaf people that I work with or have worked with, their language variety, of course, depends on where they were brought up. If you think of some of the companies that perhaps we have to work with, they have a specific language style that they use. They might use sign-supported English. We, as people who use urban sign language, don't have power to use our language in their mediums. The things that you see broadcast are actually their identity and their sign language. Now, I've worked in the media world for about 15 years. I've worked for ITV, I've worked for the BBC, I've worked for MTV. And every single organisation that I've been into, I have to adapt my language. And I hope that's clear. I have to adapt the language variety I use. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So, deaf people who were educated at private schools cannot use BSL perhaps as it currently is. They use an oralist language or sign-supported English, which is sign language that follows the grammar of English. And actually, a lot of professional deaf companies use that language variety. So they will say, I prefer sign-supported English. So you go for a job in that company, you have to remember that they use a particular language variety. You will have to use that language variety in their broadcasts and their media. When I went over to ITV, they liked me, they employed me. The people who were leading those projects, those people who were socially connected within those organisations, and we're talking here about people who use British Sign Language in a very rich and expressive way and are prescriptive in that use. You can't use sign-supported English with them. They have their own preferred language. So then you have to adapt to that specific language and you have to sign it grammatically in the way that suits them. And that's how you have to survive, isn't it? And that's how I did anyway. British Sign Language has so many different varieties of language, whether it's regional, whether it's linked to the school that you went to, it's linked to whether it's urban. We have gay sign variety, so that's very strong, particularly in London. There are so many varieties of language, and as a deaf professional, you have to adapt in every situation to please your audience and your employers. As I said, I flew back from Germany yesterday. Very, very quickly, I'd been learning German. Very quickly as possible. I'm trying to learn German Sign Language. I'm trying to learn refugee sign languages. I'm trying to learn sign languages from different countries. I'm trying to learn Iraqi Sign Language. It's extremely difficult. And that's been my experience throughout life, constantly adapting your language to get involved with and connect with people and work in their environments. Now, for hearing people, I don't know if that's something you experience. I mean, English is a universal language, I presume. Is that right? I don't know. How English is affected in terms of where you were brought up, your education, where you went to, all of these different things. A lot of people say to me that spoken English is very accessible across the world. British Sign Language isn't. British Sign Language has influenced other countries. Australia, they have their own sign language, Auslan. New Zealand, India, Jamaica. Those countries, we have influenced their sign languages. Of course, they're Commonwealth countries and they're former colonies. But of course, even though those languages have evolved to be quite distinct, they still have underlying grammatical structures that are similar to ours. So, I went over to Japan to do some work in Japan. And going to Japan, I went to Tokyo and I was working. That's the sign for Tokyo, by the way. And that's their sign. So I got over to Tokyo and I was doing some work. And of course I was doing a stand-up comedy routine out there. Now what's interesting about stand-up comedy out there is the Japanese deaf people said to me, you have to use Japanese Sign Language only. And I was thinking, okay. I wanted an interpreter. No, that was the answer. You are going to use Japanese Sign Language. And I was like, okay, right, okay. So I needed to learn my routine, my 20-minute comedy routine in Japanese Sign Language. And let me tell you, that is not easy. It's Japanese Sign Language. Let me give you an example. I'm trying to work out the signs at the time. That sign, which is asama, it means devil. Old woman is this. 20 minutes, I'm working out my entire routine in Japanese Sign Language. Anyway, I'm doing all these gestures, I'm using the sign language at the end. Everyone stands up and applauds, and they do the bow and everything else. And I'm like, oh, nailed it. And I realised at the end of that particular routine, I met this girl who was Japanese and our language was completely different. And we connected on Facebook and we agreed to go out for a date. And I was thinking, this is going to be fantastic. It's going to be absolutely brilliant. I asked what her sign name was. Now, I don't know if you know about sign names. So, deaf people have sign names that describe their character. That's my sign name, Rinku. Why that? Because I loved Italian football when I was young. That's the sign for Italy. So this Japanese deaf girl, I meet her, I said, what's your sign name? No, I don't know how to say it. I don't know that. She does this. I said, that's your sign name? Was it? All right, okay, fine, that's fine. I was telling my friend about this date that was coming up. Now, he was Japanese, and he signs British Sign Language as well because he studied in New Zealand, so he understands British Sign Language. So I was really excited. I'm having this conversation with him. I said, I'm going out with this Japanese deaf girl. My friend's sort of standing there smoking his cigarette like this, and he goes, oh, good luck, mate. And I sort of said, oh. I said, and then he sort of interrupted, and he said, what's her name? I said, I don't actually know her name. I know her sign name, like this. And he goes, oh, I know her. I know her. That's the sign that means meow, meow. Do you know that? Meow, meow. And I was standing there, I was thinking, meow, meow. Meow, meow. Yeah, meow, meow. Which I thought was really weird. Can you imagine that? So you've got a girl in this country and her name's, I don't know, Julie or something like that. And Julie wants to finish with you. And the conversation is, no, Julie, please don't finish with me. And if it's somebody else, can you imagine that situation with meow meow? No, meow, meow, don't go. Doesn't sound right. There's something not right there. There's something not right about that. The point is, I'm having this conversation with him, and I'm excited. And I meet Meow Meow the next day for the date. And I get there, and I'm like, hi, Meow Meow, good morning. And she's sort of sitting there like this. And I think, okay, does she not understand me? Okay, I need to think about this. Did you have a good sleep? You know, I'm using like really gestural language here. This is her response. Okay, I'm thinking it's not working. Are you good? And she finally says, I don't understand. Oh, she doesn't understand me. Okay, right. So I start going through all these different communication strategies. How am I going to communicate with her? She's deaf. I'm British. I can try international sign language. Maybe she could do that. Nope, didn't work. Can't communicate with this person. In the end, do you know what I did? You know Facebook Messenger? You know the GIFs? Literally, that's what I did, honestly. I had to use the Facebook Messenger GIFs to communicate with this girl. So I'm standing there and I'm pressing, do you want to eat? And I'm trying to do it like this. You know that eating GIF? Showing it to her. She's like this. No. Okay, right. I mean, can you imagine that? Honestly, the entire date, the whole night, that's what it's like. And in the end, I just gave up. I'm not doing this. And this is, I said to my Japanese friend after that, and that's why he said to me, good luck. That's not the only thing that's happened to me with languages. I've had a massive language barrier when I was young once. My mother, my family, just to let you know, my family are Punjabi. Some of them speak English, some of them speak Punjabi. I can't speak Punjabi. It's impossible for me to have learnt that. But anyway, I was at home when I was younger, and my mother said to me, Rinku, are you actually free? And I said, yeah, I'm free. And she said, can you go and pick your grandmother up and take your grandmother to the doctors? And I'm like this, you know, oh, why me? You know, I've got like 30 odd cousins, they're all living in Birmingham. Why can't one of them do it? But no, it's me. Anyway, so, you know, of course, you know, you love your grandmother. So I drove over to my grandmother's house. Now, my grandmother lived in Handsworth, and I went to pick her up. Literally, this is, and I've got to tell you this, I had forgotten about the difficulties of communicating with my grandmother. I mean, I saw her sometimes, but, you know, I ring the doorbell, and she comes over, and she's really old. She's walking like this, you know. She's a really, really old woman by this stage, and she opens up the door, and she's doing all this to me, you know. Gives me a massive hug. And I'm thinking, oh, how am I going to communicate with her? So I think this is going to be all right. It'll be okay. So I'm sort of saying, come on, get ready like this. And she's kind of, you know, I'm gesturing to her and I'm walking her to the car. Now, my grandmother sees a couple of black people, like a gang of lads walking past. She does this. And I was like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And she's smiling, you see, at these people she's doing. And I was like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. And this gang starts reacting. They're like, what are you doing? Stop doing this. And I'm like, oh, my God. So just pack it in, right? No, the thing is, I can't speak Punjabi. So I can't speak English. She can't speak English. I can't speak Punjabi. She doesn't understand sign language. I'm dragging her to the car like this. I put her into the car. I just kind of threw her in. I get into the car. Unfortunately, the road is so narrow, I can't do a 3-point turn. Because I don't know if you've ever been to Handsworth, but it's so narrow. It means I've got to drive past that gang. So I'm thinking, oh no. So I'm driving up this hill, past them. These gang members are all sitting there staring at us. And she starts doing it again as we go past, like this. And I'm like, can you stop? Can you stop? Can you stop? Right? I'm so worried about this. Every time she sees a group of black people, she starts doing this. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? I don't understand. Why are you doing it? And why are you smiling? Right, anyway, we get to the doctors. And, of course, we walk into the doctor's surgery. And I try and introduce my grandmother to the receptionist. Unfortunately, she's trying to talk to me, and I'm deaf. So I'm trying to lip read what she's saying. We work out she wants us to sit down. We sit down. And, of course, the receptionist calls out the name of my grandmother. I don't hear it. I can't hear it. My grandmother doesn't understand English. So we're just sitting there, and they're calling out the name. I don't know how this is going to work, and we're just waiting and waiting and waiting, and eventually They have to come out and get us. We take my grandmother into the room with the doctor, and the doctor sits there, and I think, uh-oh, how's this going to work? Right? The doctor was one of those really kind of, very prim and proper doctors sort of sitting there with his little notepad or whatever it is. He starts talking really fast. Mate, I'm deaf. Can you slow down? I can't lip read. Right, what is the problem? My grandma's just sitting there like this. That's what I do. I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I'm trying to work out, how do I say this to her? And she starts rubbing her stomach like this. Is it your stomach? And she goes, oh yeah, stomach, something like that. And this three-way breakdown of communication that's happening. In the end, we gave up. Luckily, we found a nurse who spoke Punjabi. And she comes in, problem solved, right? I take her home, and I bring up with my mother this swearing at black people thing. I said to her, what's going on? I said, Mom, look, we've got a problem here. There's a problem with Grandma. My mum said, what do you mean? I said, look, every single time she sees a gang in Handsworth, she swears. And my grandmother's like, really? How bad is that? And I was like, she's doing this at gang members. I said, I could have been shot. My mother says, oh, I'll have to find out what's going on. So she goes over to my grandmother and says, why are you doing this? My grandmother goes, this is the honest truth. She gives the story in Punjabi. And she says, oh, I do this. I'll tell you why. This is the reason why. I thought it meant cold. And I was like, what? Where did you get that idea from? Where did you get that from? And she went, there was this little black boy in my street, and he runs up to my house, knocks on the door, and when I come out and open the door, this is what he does. And she thought that was cool, so she was doing that to every single black person she saw. Yes.
Thank you very much for that, Rinku. So we got a bit of context, and we also got a sense of sign languages and urban sign languages as well. And just to make clear, and hopefully that came across in Rinku's talk and presentation, that urban sign languages is a contested form, but it's also a very artistic and a creative form which people like Rinku, and particularly people from the black minority ethnic communities, are constructing and co-creating themselves. So I think that's quite important to know. So we've got a good at least 15 plus minutes for questions, comments and conversations. So I'm going to just start off with one, if I may, and then we'll open the floor. Okay, great. So Rinku, urban sign languages, how is it developing? I know we worked on it together as part of Slanguages, the exhibition that we launched at Wolfson College in Oxford. But what are some of the more formal or semi-formal mechanisms that you're aware of or that you're involved in that's helping promote or develop it with the formal, if you like, sign language community? Or actually is it that they are still reticent of it and it is considered as maybe something that's colloquial, idiosyncratic, or it's a slang form that maybe peer groups do amongst themselves? Is it being taken seriously, or is there much work to be done?
So I think at the moment it's not formally recognised at all, but of course urban sign language is that everyday vernacular that's being used by people. Talking from my own experience anecdotally, that of course urban sign language isn't completely isolated to black and ethnic minorities. White deaf people are beginning to use urban sign languages, but that's because they think it's cool. They think it's fashionable, so it's spreading out. What you also see is that the growth of social media is a powerful medium now for deaf people. They're using, for instance, urban signs like POW, which of course, is a universal sign, and I'm picking that up and I'm seeing that grow. Unfortunately, being completely honest, urban sign language is not in the mainstream deaf media, and it's not used on those kind of credible platforms. And I think that might be because a lot of those people who use sign language have the aim of delivering information as clearly and as logically as possible. What's interesting for me is the comparison between hearing and deaf. Hearing people do use slang language or pieces of slang in mainstream media, but deaf people don't. And we're behind, if you like, in that sense. Talking to my own friends about urban sign languages, I asked them whether they watch sign language programs today, and they do, but they find them boring because it's not their language that's being represented on screen. That's not what they're seeing. They're not seeing vernaculars, and they're not seeing everything that's used today. So I think just as we've evolved languages in Britain and the United States, you know, I strongly believe, of course, that languages are constantly evolving, and I think that urban sign language is one of those languages. And of course, it has reasons for its evolution, and they are strongly linked to things like discrimination, racism, and all of that.
Thank you. Would you mind just giving us 2 or 3 quick examples of, if you like, a British Sign Language or a formal sign language and its urban sign language variant? Just 2 or 3 examples, please.
Okay, here's one. A good example, 2 days ago when I was in Germany. Just to let you know, I have 3 languages currently floating around my head. You know, when you talk to yourself, so I talk to myself sometimes, and I'm trying to work things out in my head. So whether I'm using sort of BSL or urban sign languages. When I was in Germany, I was in Hamburg. Funnily enough, the sign is hamburger. I saw this really tall woman, and she's walking up to me like this, and I signed to myself, "Bloody hell." Well, I said it first. Now, the urban sign is this. That is bloody hell. We don't even have a sign for bloody hell in British Sign Language. So that's just an example of it by itself. In British Sign Language, walk is this. Urban is this. Let me think of another one for you. Car, drive. So we have, for instance, car. This is in British Sign Language. This is the nationally recognised sign. You can pick that up. Newcastle, it's this. Yeah, honestly. Urban Sign Language is this.
One-handed.
Do you see what I mean? So, yeah.
Thank you, that's very useful. Should we open the floor? Comments, conversations, interactions?
So you mentioned that you just went to Germany and you were speaking out German Sign Language, Iranian Sign Language, all these lots of sign languages. How does that work? How do you understand all these different signs?
That's a really good question. I don't know how. I actually don't know how. You have receptive skills, and I think that I would say that. Well, here's a question. I don't know. Does everyone have the same quality of cognition? I don't know. Do we all have the same quality of understanding things? I don't know. It's a deeply individual thing, I think. When I went to Germany, I wonder if the skill has been practiced so much that I've had to pick up languages all the time. And I push myself hard, because being a child, I had to do that. I had to learn that skill. I had to constantly try to lip read. So now, when I'm trying to understand different sign languages, I might find that process easier. There are varieties of language, for instance, that you've never seen. So you have to push yourself, don't you, to try to understand what it might mean. But I do think that one of the key drivers for me learning languages is motivation. That's how I'm capable of understanding them in the end. It's as simple as that, I think. And I do pick up sign languages quickly.
Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. I have a little bit of questions about some of your experiences before the age of 8, when you said that you first started signing, and just wondering if you could say something about your early language development. What communication looked like, how it manifested before that stage?
So, as I said to you, I grew up in a hearing family, hearing world. The school was hearing. Nobody used sign languages. And learning a language was extremely difficult. So they're talking to me or at me, but I didn't get 100% of what was going on. I couldn't even follow it. So context was missing for me. I would struggle to understand, and you just got to the point where I didn't listen at all. I never forget being at school and the hearing teacher just sort of talking, and I'm just dreaming of something else because I just couldn't understand what was going on. You can't hear it. You know, your eyes are focused on one place for an hour, their lips. You know, your eyes start hurting, you're trying to work out what's going on. Sign language came along and it was completely different. It gave you motivation, you started to understand what was happening, you understood what was happening around you in the world, and you started to answer your own questions. Why am I even here? You know, I used to be like a robot before the age of 8. Yes, no, do this, do that. You're just sitting there, no real development going on. Sign language comes along, a 3D language that you can understand. And that's what I meant earlier when I talked about feeling the language. You know, the richness and the depth of this language and being able to learn it. For me, the medium of speaking was associated with just focusing on somebody's lips. I mean, you guys know about intonation, for instance. I can't hear that. It just sounds the same to me. That was part of the problem.
Thank you very much. I've got a question for your interpreter, actually.
Yeah, feel free to ask him. Yeah, go ahead.
How did you get involved in this? Because obviously you're a young person.
My family is deaf. So my parents are deaf and I have deaf cousins and so on. And then I was a translator. I was a professionally trained translator in sign language for about 4 years. Then I went back to university. I did an interpreting degree. And then I just worked professionally.
So do you speak the same urban language, or did you have to learn it?
What Rinku's just going to answer that for you. Rinku's saying, today I've used British Sign Language because I need to make sure that all the information, but Cam can pick up urban sign language and, you know, I could teach him anyway.
And just following on from that, Cam, if I may. So when you're working in a creative way like today, because it's a very creative way of Rinku telling us a bit, almost like a public lecture, but then also doing a little bit of stand-up comedy, do you two meet prior to have a conversation, have a discussion about that? Are there certain cues or certain moments that you have to look out for? How does that kind of translation but also creative process work, if you might call it that?
It's a difficult process. It's not like normal interpreting, if you can term interpreting normal, because obviously I know Rinku, but it's not a case of just solely representing all of those lexical items and the grammatical structure, which interpreting isn't anyway. It's about summarising Rinku as a person and projecting that out to you. And ideally, for me, interpreting would be that anyway, but you tend to find that there is a divide between what I might call normal interpreting and creative sort of interpreting. The process that I follow with Rinku, and that I follow where, for instance, if I work in theatre, which I do a lot, is, of course, I'll meet with him beforehand and he will tell his stories and whatever it is that he wants to talk about. And he has his own shorthand way of signing, and because I know him well, but because I'm familiar with his material and I know the point that he's trying to get across, I will put that across. But I have to have that agreed beforehand, because otherwise the representation that you get of Rinku is actually me. And one of the difficult things that I found in creative interpreting is that you're such a mediator that you become the focus, which is one of the reasons that I think it's really important that your interpreters are not only highly skilled, but they understand the social and political aspects of what they're doing.
Thank you. question here or comment?
Thank you for your interesting talk. I've got a question about the facial expression of sign languages. So apart from the differences in different sign languages, different regions or countries, are there any difference in terms of the facial expressions? I do not know any sign languages, but I noticed in Chinese sign language, we do not really have any facial expression at all. So when they talk about story, they have the same expression as they talk about read news. But in UK, it's very typical when they report news, it's like storytelling. You can see, the differences of the facial expression. So I'm interested in that.
Do you know, it's really good you said that, because I've got a specific experience about that. I backpack, or I was backpacking, and I was with a Chinese backpacker. Now, one of the things about the British deaf community is that, and the language they use, is that facial expressions are extremely important. They're termed non-manual features, or they were termed non-manual features, and they're part of the language of sign language. So when we say rain, for instance, this is how we say it. Heavy rain, that is. Can you see the way I've sort of framed my face there, non-manual features? That means heavy. I never say heavy. I'm not going to say heavy. I'm just going to sign heavy and have that facial expression. Facial expression means heavy. Gently raining. Yeah? It's the facial expressions that are acting as a sort of inflection there. So going back to your question about Chinese sign language, one of the interesting things that I learned from a Chinese deaf backpacker that I was with in the United States, we went to Utah, which, we went, I think it was Red Rock we went to, and we're sort of having this conversation, and this moment happens. I respond to this person in a typical British deaf way. I do this, and you all know what that means as British people. You get that expression, right? This Chinese deaf person sort of says to me, I just want to tell you that over in China, we don't use those kind of facial expressions like this, all this sort of stuff you're doing. No. I said, what do you mean? What, no facial expression? No. So I asked why. He just said it's not the done thing. And I think there was something there that I think it's a social pressure, a social construct. So as you've kind of, I don't know whether socially it's acceptable out in China to express yourself visually like that. I don't know. Here in England, when I do my comedy, it's different for hearing people. If you look at, say, a stand-up comedian, they stand like this and do their comedy like that. They're all the same style, standing there. And I think to myself, why would you do that? Move around, mime, act, do all of the movements that you would expect. That's how we storytell. It's a cultural and social issue, a pressure that comes from the culture around you, I think. I mean, here in Britain, you look at the Queen and you look at the way she sits and represents herself. You don't see her doing the sort of stuff I do. That's not what they do. And I think British people tend to take, or have taken, our cultural cues from those type of people. I don't know if you went to the United States, they're so free in the way they express themselves, throwing their arms everywhere and all this kind of stuff. I think it plays a part in the language. So I wonder if in China, whether there's a political or a cultural thing that impacts the way that deaf people use their languages. And that's just, of course, my view,
Got a couple more minutes, so we've got questions or comments. There's one there.
Hi, really interesting. Thank you. Obviously, you're using comedy as a way of being creative with your language. How else can you be creative with sign language?
Are you talking specifically about comedy?
Just sign language in general. How do you think being able to sign?
Well, one of the things I would say about this is, so my preferred medium of communication is sign language, because it allows me 100% of my expressive ability. And you can use it in performance art, in poetry, storytelling. It's suited to that expressionate form. So when I speak, I don't like to speak. And I wonder if that's because I think my speech sounds boring, whereas when I'm doing sign language, it looks exciting. And that's what it can be used for. It's because it's such a 3D language, it can be understood as well in a variety of forms.
Just following on from that, Rinku, you're all, yeah, I'm going to come back to her, but just to follow on from that, but you're also a filmmaker as well, and that's a really creative process. Would you mind just saying something a little bit about that, maybe as an extension of that question of how you, as a deaf filmmaker, but then also as a sign language filmmaker, do you work with people who can hear and those who don't hear? I mean, how does that creative process work? Or do you have a mediator or a translator in between you and your fellow artists?
So there are deaf filmmakers, and there are of course deaf producers, for instance. So, and there are deaf production companies. There are deaf productions. There's BSL Zone. There's BBC's See Here programme. What I can say is that, you know, a long time ago, a lot of deaf people didn't have the skills that were necessary to get involved in that because they didn't have the qualifications or the experience, actually. And they would have to partner up with hearing people to do it. But sort of 30 years later, you've now got, of course, deaf professionals who have been able to learn by getting access to the courses and different things. And the way they get access is through having sign language interpreters there. And I've used interpreters myself. Previously, I remember, you know, deaf films used to have these like perfect frames, you know, and you used to have a person sort of standing very fixed, signing away in a particular way. I didn't like that. I hated that sort of convention. I like that, you know, I like French films myself. I like French film style. So, you know, there's a film called In the film Double Discrimination that I did, I actually filmed something on a bus. I filmed a black deaf person in Handsworth on the bus, and you could see all these deaf people afterwards saying, you can't do that. That's not a sort of agreed way of filming and sort of doing things. So I like to kind of break those conventions. If you look at, say, sort of primetime news and all of that sort of stuff, you have an in-vision interpreter who's sort of stuck in the corner interpreting what's being said. And that's kind of the mainstream sort of way of doing it, but we haven't yet broken a lot of the conventions, you know, that hearing people are willing to break.
Thank you.
Yes, just kind of going back to the creativity side of things, actually, I think it links to film-making stuff. I think that such an interesting part of deaf culture is how oral it is, and I don't mean oral spoken language, I mean oral face-to-face communication, not written, person-to-person, passed on. And I think, I completely agree with you about filmmaking in slightly more creative ways, because my impression has been that when a conversation between deaf people is filmed, it's much more engaging than just one person signing straight to camera, because you can see the interactions going on. And additionally, I'm coming back to the creativity side of things. There's been a lot of research into sign language poetry, but there's kind of an emphasis on it's a kind of literary, sort of formal, stage-based sort of thing. Whereas increasingly, I think that you can just see everyday poetry happening in sign language much more spontaneously than in spoken languages. And I suppose I just wanted to ask you about that, about the kind of the everyday poetics of in urban sign language, which is something that I don't know about at all. I'm very familiar with British sign language, but urban sign language, the kind of everyday creativity, everyday poetics. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
That's a really good question, and yes, urban sign language, as it's sort of spread out, it is out there. I think one of the things is that because it's got its own jargon and everything else, it isn't getting into the mainstream sign languages that are represented in the media and so on. But in terms of poetry within the language, one of the things that we're trying to do originally, or first, if you like, is first get it established, which means that people can use it. You know, until we've established it, it's still an oppressed language, isn't it? Then they can't express their own art through it because it's not out there and established. You know, in one way, what I want to do is to show people that they can use it, that they can learn it and use it. One of the most difficult things that I found is to understand poetry in sign language. because it's difficult to understand even the grammar. And I'm not particularly talented or skilled at that myself. I don't know whether I've actually answered your question.
I don't agree that you're not poetic. I've seen you do storytelling and stand-up, and I think I suppose it's fun.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
That's a lovely...
Play and sign play handshakes that mean two things at once. I've seen you do instinctively. I suppose that's kind of what I mean, is that it's something that's so embedded in the oral culture of their communities.
I know it might be that it's something that we've not been trained about. What is poetry? I don't know the formal definition of poetry. If you tell me what you mean by it, I might film myself and look at it and think, oh, yeah, it's there. And I might have just missed that it exists in my own language.
There's a poet in all of us. That's a lovely comment. So let's finish there, and we'll just have a couple of minutes whilst the final panel transits in. And let's all thank Rinku again for a really informative session. Thank you very much.
Oh, Japanese sign for thank you.